A Sunday school teacher wanted to make sure that her class was all ready for the Christmas pageant. Now, I remember some Christmas pageants here that went off in very interesting fashions. I will never forget Gold Frankenstein and Myrrh. So she patiently asked the class, who came to Bethlehem? The shepherds came, said little Norma. The 3 kings came, said her big sister Margaret. The donkey came, said 4-year-old Grace. And then little Joey raised his hand and said, and then the stork came. In our Christmas pageants, everything happens at the same time. We have a condensed version. Mary and Joseph turn up in a very overcrowded Bethlehem. She has the fastest labor in history and gives birth in a stable. Then the shepherds arrive, and then before we know it, there's the 3 wise men. Everything can take place in 15 minutes. We've got it down. But the reality does not fit our artificially tight schedule. In point of fact, we don't actually know when the wise men arrived at all. The range is anywhere between January 6th and 2 years later. We have no idea. Matthew's gospel doesn't help us out here. All we are told is that shortly after the wise men left, a crisis occurred. Because when they did not return to Herod, Herod knew that he had been tricked. And Herod had one overriding obsession that determined everything he did. Herod wanted to stay in power. That was his focus. And to do so, he destroyed completely any potential competition. This included members of his own family, his own loved ones. He murdered one of his wives, her brother, her mother, her grandfather, and his 2 sons by his marriage to her. He also murdered his firstborn son by a previous marriage. In total, Herod was married 8 times and had 14 children. The best place to be where Herod was concerned was as far away as possible. The 3 sons that survived only did so because their mothers took them to Rome. This was not a tyrant to be taken lightly. Joseph was warned in a dream to take Jesus and Mary to Egypt because Herod was seeking to destroy him. And Joseph acted promptly. They left in the middle of the night. The danger was imminent and serious. And Egypt was a very logical place to go. We picture wilderness when we picture Egypt. We picture, the Great Pyramids. We don't picture where they actually went, which would have been into a very large, bustling, cosmopolitan city. Egypt was their version of off the grid. And it was perfect because there was a very large Jewish population of about 1 million people living in Egypt. It was 150 miles away. It was far, but not too far. But it was totally out of Herod's range. Mary and Joseph could have lived off of the gifts that the wise men gave them, selling them piece by piece, all along the way and until Joseph got himself reestablished in Egypt. Think about it. He didn't have time to go back and get his tools. He had to start anew as a carpenter and open a new business to support the family while they were there. Now we know that Jesus' life was saved by his swift action, but all the other innocent children did lose their lives. This was not God's will. This was Herod's will. Given the size of Bethlehem at the time, it is likely that somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 Jewish boys under the age of 2 would have been killed. But there's no mention of this outside of the Bible. But that's not unusual. Given the amount of atrocities that took place in Herod's reign, and the fact that children, particularly Jewish children, were not highly ranked in terms of value, it would have just been like, well, it's Tuesday. No big deal. He killed a bunch of kids. What would have struck the Jewish readers of the story right away, however, is the similarity between this and what happened with Moses when the infants were killed when Moses was born. The parallels were there. Herod became the new Pharaoh. Both Jesus and Moses were born with the threat of death hanging over their heads, and both were divinely protected. When Herod finally died, an angel of the Lord once more appeared to Joseph to tell him that those who were trying to take the child's life were dead. It was safe to go home. And so the family returned, but they didn't return to where they came from, because Herod's former territory had been divided between his 3 sons. And the one who got Judea, Archelaus, was unstable and violent. He very quickly got a bad reputation. In fact, Archelaus only reigned 9 years before the Romans had to pull him out. He was that bad. But Archelaus was there when the family returned, and so, being warned again, Joseph took the family to a new place, to a tiny village called Nazareth in the district of Galilee. Nazareth was a small Jewish enclave of between 200 to 400 people, really tiny, but near a large style, in the Greek style city called Sepphoris, a very prosperous city. The Gospel of Matthew was written for a Jewish audience. And because of this, it is teeming with Old Testament scripture references. Scriptures that are said to be fulfilled by Jesus. Now, for you and I, these claims often don't even make sense. Because I look at the context and I go, what are you talking about? It is jarring to me. The scripture that is quoted, Hosea 11 verse 1, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son, is not a prophecy at all. It's a description of how God saved the people from slavery in Egypt. The second citation, Rachel weeping for her children, is taken from Jeremiah 31:15. Rachel, Jacob's wife, had been dead for centuries when Jeremiah portrayed her as weeping as the people, her children, were taken past her tomb into exile in Babylonia. This verse has nothing to do with the slaughter of innocents in Bethlehem. And as for the final reference about Jesus being a Nazarene, we can't even find one in the scriptures. There's nothing specific. It may be a reference to a writing outside of what became the Jewish canon, or a general interpretation. in addition to the scriptures that Matthew's gospel cites, the phrasing and the language is deliberately evocative of Moses. Were all these early Christians just off the wall, finding things that were not there, stretching a point so far that it snapped? This is what modern day people would say, but not in context, because we are coming to these passages with our modern biases. But within ancient Judaism, allegorical and symbolic interpretation was normal. This is what everyone did. Everyone at the time of Jesus within the Pharisaic rabbinic tradition looked at scriptures and saw them in a different way. They took something that meant one thing and gave it another meaning to apply it to a different time and place. Tiny fragments of scripture even that were understood literally in one way were given entirely new meanings. So when the early Christians sat down with the Hebrew scriptures and began to see references to Jesus everywhere they looked, they were doing what Palestinian and Egyptian Jews have always done. They were reinterpreting scripture with new eyes to fit a new circumstance. If we understand that what these early Christians were really doing was speaking the language of their culture to reach people in their culture, we don't have to let it become a stumbling block for us. Whether God was fulfilling scripture in unique ways or doing something entirely new, what is clear is this: Jesus, the Son of God, became a very vulnerable human being for us. Babies cannot defend themselves. If Herod's own family wasn't safe, no one else was either. So God hid Jesus from sight until the right time. Just because a bully demands that you put your head in a noose does not mean you do so. The world is full of evil. To fight it requires wisdom and timing. Joseph and Mary were living very ordinary lives before all these angels arrived and totally turned it upside down, and they found themselves in the middle of God's divine plan. They weren't looking for this. The circumstances found them. What they did with the chaos was obey God one step at a time. Hindsight is a beautiful thing, but Mary and Joseph didn't know what was ahead any more than we know what's ahead. God didn't provide them with the blueprint of their entire lives, everything that was going to happen, good, bad, and indifferent. Who could live like that? If I knew half of the things that had happened to me in my life ahead of time, I would have given up before I started, because I wouldn't have believed myself capable of surviving and getting through them. But God knows, and God gives us what we need and when we need it. Even if our lives and our calling is far more ordinary than Mary and Joseph, our loving and wise God does the same for us that God did for them. Our future is hid with God, and our present is to be lived trusting God to provide and protect us. We do not need to fear what the future holds because God is already there. God knows how to take care of us far better than we know how to take care of ourselves. Amen.